This is the Modern American Dream Objective 1 Part 1 regarding the Red Scare and the Ku Klux Klan and the influence that the Red Scare had at the beginning of the Roaring Twenties and the influence that the Klan has had ever since the Civil War. So if you could, take a look at your study guide regarding the Red Scare of 1919 to 1920, and let's get into the role of the Bolshevik Revolution. Now, if you take a look here, this is a picture of the Bolshevik Revolution that happened in Russia. It's what made Russia into the Soviet Union. It's what created communism there. And after World War I, it plays a role in the United States as well, because we were ready to denounce many of the new immigrants, not the ones that came from around England and were white and Anglo-Saxon and Protestant, but actually the immigrants that are coming in from Eastern Europe, like the Russians and the Poles, and Southern Europe, like the Italians and the Portuguese, and Asia, because they practice so many different religions, different skin colors, everything like that. That really had not gone away during the new immigration period, and people back here were very concerned about it. Anyway, back to the Bolshevik Revolution. The Bolshevik Revolution in Russia is when communism gets started, like I said. And as soon as communism begins, this guy right here, named Vladimir Lenin, tells workers around the world to unite and rebel. He was the leader of the Bolshevik Party in Russia. Now, you can imagine if you've got a capitalist-loving country like America and somebody's telling all the workers to rebel, well, you get real concerns about labor strikes and everything like that. The American Communist Party actually forms in the 1920s, shortly thereafter this time. And every time a strike happened, everybody freaked out and thought it was the end of the world and that that communism was on the shores. I mean, Vladimir Lenin had just got done telling people, workers of the world, unite, rebel against your capitalist oppressors. So people back here decided they needed to do something like that, about that. And in the early 1920s, around 1919, 1920, you get a guy named A. Now, Palmer was this guy right here. And Palmer worked for the government, and he led a series of raids against anyone who was accused of being a communist. Overall, about roughly 6,000 people. Now, as you can see here, the idea was that they were going to hunt down suspected communists, socialists, anybody who was anti-government, but that was suspected. And in the process, everybody's civil rights basically get squashed. Nobody got due process of law. They just invaded private homes, jailed suspects, no legal counsel, no trial, most of the time no evidence, and basically deported people who they just suspected of being communists. Now, there were other things that they tried to do as well, but that was really the result of actions that took place after the Palmer raids. After a while, Palmer, it's decided, doesn't really know what he's doing, and so the Palmer raids stop, but the organization that Palmer created continued on. Now, the guy who led that organization shortly thereafter is a young man named J. Edgar Hoover. And the organization that Palmer started, led by Hoover, eventually came to be known as the FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation. The FBI got started because of the Palmer raids in the 1920s. And the young man, J. Edgar Hoover, would lead the FBI for the next 40 years. But the things that they would do, in addition to the Palmer raids that deal with this whole idea of the Red Scare of communism, had to do with criminal syndication or syndicalism laws that limited anti-government free speech. There was also an American plan. These were anti-union tactics practiced by business owners, and other aspects as well. But sooner or later, these uglier sides of the discrimination against immigrants kept bubbling up to the top. Now, the next thing that happens in that regard is the trial of Sacco and Vanzetti. Now, these two guys here, Nicola Sacco and Bartholomew Vanzetti, were convicted of murder in 1921. The problem was that a lot of people didn't think they got due process of law. Many believed that the jury and the judge were prejudiced against them for being Italian, for being atheists, and for being anarchists. They were people who weren't real big on government rule. Now, for that reason, a lot of people just felt like that they needed to be jailed at the least and executed at the worst. But it kind of played into this hysteria because the evidence against Sacco and Vanzetti just for the murder was kind of sketchy, and it almost started to seem like with people across the country that they were being targeted. So for the next 6 years, a lot of different people on the left wing, liberals and radicals, came to the defense of Sacco and Vanzetti. it didn't do any good, as Sacco and Vanzetti were eventually executed in 1927. Now, on the other side of this as well, or another part of this anti-immigrant feeling or nativist feeling, had to do with the Ku Klux Klan, which actually had gotten started way back right after the Civil War, right as the new immigration period was beginning. Now, the Klan was a WASP, a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant group. They claimed that they represented Christianity, although many Protestants would probably disagree. But the bottom line here is that the Klan gets started with conservative terrorism, really one of the first groups to practice terrorism in the history of the world during the time period right after the Civil War. Basically, the Klan, the Ku Klux Klan, has to do with the never-ending circle. It's also known today as the 311 because K is the 11th letter in the alphabet. And the targets of the Klan include anyone who is non-WASP or a sympathizer for anyone who is non-WASP. Now, the thing about that is that people always think the Klan, we knew they didn't like African-American people, but most people don't realize that they target anybody who's not white. So, Mexicans, Italians, whatever. They target anybody who's not Anglo-Saxons. They target Russians, Poles, Eastern Europeans, Southern Europeans, Asians. They target anybody who's not Protestant. So they target Catholics, they target Jews, they target all these different groups. Now, the group actually gets started in Pulaski, Tennessee in 1866, right after the Civil War. It began as a social club, but it began as a social club, just like an organization or whatever the case may be. The problem is that they are very upset about Reconstruction governments in the South. And they basically create the concept of terrorism because after the Civil War, there was no Southern army to fight these Reconstruction governments. So they did what they felt like they had to do, and those were terrorist tactics, hit-and-run tactics, burning crosses to show the shining light of Jesus Christ for their cause, and the white robes of purity that they wore, at least in their particular mind in terms of what they were doing. Now, for the next 100 years, they're going to be a pretty strong organization. At first, they're just going after freed slaves and new immigration. And you'll notice that during these times, their numbers would boost anytime there were targets. Newly freed slaves gave them a reason to gather and go after them. By the 1890s, they're kind of slowed down by anti-Klan laws, but they actually experienced a revolt in 1916 under the leadership of this guy, William Simmons. Now, Simmons brought them to a place 10 minutes outside of Atlanta called Stone Mountain, Georgia. And here's a picture of Stone Mountain today and what it looks like. The revival rally for the Klan was held there. And the pictures that you see here, or the people carved into the wall, are Jefferson Davis on the far left, Robert E. Lee in the middle, and Stonewall Jackson on the far right, leaders of the Confederate cause in the Civil War. By the 1920s, membership in the Klan had reached 5 million people. It was strongest in the South, obviously, but it was also strong in other places. You can see the numbers increasing here up to 5 million as they march down Pennsylvania Avenue, or march down the streets of Washington away from the Capitol. And in places like the South, like I said, they were very strong, but Indiana was probably the biggest Klan state of the 1920s. As was, if you take a look, Michigan. Here's a certification for someone who just joined the Klan in Newaygo County in Michigan. And this is a picture of a Klan funeral in Hesperia, Michigan. Matter of fact, down by the Lansing area, it's often referred to as the Klan Belt from Charlotte or a little bit west of Lansing, going all the way over to Heartland on the west side of Detroit. It's long been known as the Klan Belt area there. Now, as you can imagine, they're going to get stronger again. The membership is going to decline in the Klan during the 1930s because everybody's kind of concentrating on the Great Depression, and the 1940s because of World War II. But in the 1950s and the 60s, the Civil Rights Movement becomes really big, and of course, anytime any reform for African Americans or any other groups comes up, the Klan, that's when they gather and become strong. So they were revived again in the 1950s and the 1960s due to the Civil Rights Movement. Today, we live in probably the most tolerant time in our history, so the Klan itself is a pretty small organization these days, at least people think. But nobody really knows for sure, primarily because, it's not necessarily out in the open. Some people claim that the Klan is actually privately and quietly growing, even here in Michigan. But I guess I'll leave that up to you. Okay, thanks a lot.